Dream Visits, Book 3 of Stories for Your Inner Child by Steve Gallegos. Chapter 1, Dream of the Village. David could see the village in the distance. He seemed to be flying high above it. Then he realized he was Eagle, surfing on the air. The air was a landscape he could feel with various layers of density, and he instinctively moved his wings and feathers in order to maintain a position on the surface of the sea of air that supported him. He was amazed at the power of his wings. With a few beats he could climb from one level to another. But even more amazing was the precision of his vision. He could see the village in its entire breadth, stretched out between the mountain and the sea. And at the same moment he could see very precisely what the various people below were doing. It was a kind of seeing that he had not known as a human. He realized that the village seemed much older than he had remembered it. And suddenly he saw several large ships in the sea. Ships with large sails. Many tiny humans were swarming into small rowboats that were traveling back and forth between the ships and the village. He looked more closely and saw that many of the men were dressed as sailors and had beards. Many of them at the edge of the village carried rifles or swords. He didn't recognize anyone in the village, and that surprised him, because he had known everyone when he had lived there. A sudden realization jarred him. The village that he saw and the ships and all the people were several hundred years before his time. He was looking into a scene from the past. As he looked more precisely, he saw that the sailors were not at all interested in the life of the village, nor in the particular people that lived there, but they seemed glued to things in the village. They were going around touching some of the carved posts and handling various blankets, and even feeling some of the blankets and clothes and hats as the villagers were wearing them. This intrusiveness was exactly the opposite of the respect that he himself had known in the village. He realized that what he was seeing was a meeting of two different kinds of people, of two different cultures, and that what each culture experienced was very different. The sailors had no sense of the depth of feeling in the village culture, and the village people did not initially realize that the sailors were hardened and coarse and saw the world only in terms of acquisition. He knew that the main perspective in the village was a deep respect for aliveness itself, but the sailors seemed oblivious to the living people and only looked at things that were lifeless. With his eagle eyes, he saw that the sailors were arrogant and disrespectful toward the villagers, treating them like the goods they were inspecting, and that the villagers, with their natural respect for aliveness, were puzzled and perplexed. At one edge of the village, David saw one of the sailors touching a young girl in an aggressive way and showing her his teeth. Her father, standing nearby, grabbed him and pulled him away. Surprised, the sailor pointed his weapon at the man and fired. Everyone in the village froze as he fell to the ground, covered in blood. The two groups faced each other, the sailors with weapons drawn, and the villagers not knowing how to respond. The tension seemed to cause the air itself to stand still, and Eagle sailed directly into the crowd. Eagle's claws raked across the face of the man who had fired, opening deep cuts. The man dropped his weapon and grabbed at his face with both hands. Every eye was on Eagle, and the sailors began a quick retreat to the boats that had carried them to the shore. The entire village knew that nature had come to protect them, and rushed at the sailors, pushing them toward the boats and sending them on their way. David awoke, panting and sweating. He couldn't seem to breathe deep or fast enough. Opening his eyes, he looked around the guest room, relieved to find himself here at his childhood home. But a part of him was still overlooking the village, aware of the conflict, and realizing that he was being called to action. He just didn't know what he was to do. Chapter 2, Clawface. David's dreams continued night after night. They were similar and different, but always he was Eagle, flying high over the village. He came to regard the dreams as a sort of historical perspective of the life of the village. He wrote them down so he could eventually tell grandfather about them, and perhaps journey into them himself. He saw the wooden ships with large sails return for the second time, but now there were many more ships, and the sailor whose face he had raked with his claws was among the men. He had 3 long scars that ran up each cheek. They had been roughly sewn so that the stitches had also left scars of their own. And David thought they looked like the tracks of a small bird dragging a worm, or like fine red carvings. The man had let his beard grow long and bushy to try to hide them, but they continued up each cheek, had missed the eyes, and ran for a short way up his forehead. The man looked ferocious, and David could see that the men he was with both reviled and feared him. David wasn't sure whether he had heard his name from the other men, or if it just appeared on its own, Clawface. The men entered the village with a ferociousness and even greater disrespect than he had seen before. Storming into the village, they began taking whatever they wished, pushing people aside and forcing their way into the houses. Eagle saw Clawface searching, looking around for something or someone, and Eagle knew he was looking for the young girl that he had approached so roughly the first time the ships had come. Eagle also searched for her with his keen eyesight, and he was relieved to see that she was in the mountains with her father and mother and little brother. They were searching for mushrooms and had already gathered 2 small baskets of them. Eagle knew they would be bringing them back to share with the entire village. Eagle also noticed that Clawface regularly looked up into the sky, and there was always fear on his face, and he flinched whenever he looked up. Eagle knew he was looking for him. Eagle hoped the sailors would leave before the girl and her family returned from the mountains, but he knew that probably would not happen. The sailors continued to abuse people in the village, slapping some of them, and even shooting 2 of the men who tried to intervene. The girl and her family, returning from the mountains with their cache of mushrooms, heard the shots and stopped abruptly. They crept quietly toward the village and stopped suddenly before leaving the tree line, seeing the mayhem that was happening in their village. Whispering quietly, they understood the danger, were tempted to rush into the village to try to help their friends, but hesitated and thought it wiser to wait and watch, realizing that there was little they could do. Then the father saw Clawface and surged forward, being held back by his wife and 2 children. They knew that if he entered the village, they would all be slaughtered, or worse. Eagle could only observe from his treetop, but he was relieved that the family remained hidden. Chapter 3, Dreaming. David had learned from grandfather that there were various types of dreams, and that most dreams were personal dreams, guiding the individual into growing or healing. Other dreams foreshadowed happenings that later occurred, and still other dreams were instructional or transformational dreams meant for mankind in general. But the dreams David was receiving seemed to be indicative of historical times, and that he was experiencing events that had taken place long ago. But he was surprised by the fact that Eagle, through whom he was viewing the events, had even participated in some of them. But perhaps participation was a way of recognizing his own essence among the people of the village. He realized that he cared deeply for the entire village and everyone in it, and that some sort of action was or would be needed in protection. How does one person protect an entire village? His dreams left him with many questions and few answers, but they did awaken him to the fact that he felt himself to be more a member of the village than of this home that he had just recently returned to, except for Cornelia. His feelings toward Cornelia were complex. He realized she was a sister that he had always missed, even though he had just now met her for the first time. He also felt a deeply protective care for her. But there was also this strange mystery, the mystery of a deep wisdom that he recognized in her, and that didn't seem to have a place within his understanding. How could such a young person have such a powerful way of knowing? Her knowing, her understanding, her wisdom was much deeper and older than she was. David knew he would have to take her to meet grandfather. Chapter 4. Jarred. But then David had another dream that jarred him to the core. He was again looking through the eyes of eagle. A single ship had arrived in the bay, and a lone rowboat had left the ship and was making its way toward the village slowly. The people of the village were all gathered along the shore, some of them armed with clubs and knives and other weapons. David watched as the rowboat crept along the water's surface, bobbing and slowly moving toward the mob of villagers. When it was close to shore, Clawface suddenly jumped out of the boat and waded toward the villagers. To David, this felt like an act of suicide. Surely they would kill him. As he reached shore, the armed villagers gathered around him. His rowing companions remained in the small boat, apprehensive about whether they should leave immediately, but holding their breath while watching the scene that was unfolding. No one touched Clawface. There was something about his presence that seemed to surround him with a glow. The crowd parted to let him through, and he walked directly up to the father of the young woman with whom he had initially had such an intrusive meeting. David saw him talking and gesturing to the father. The father stood in silence with his daughter, wife, and son at his side. Clawface continued to gesture, to plead, to speak more and more rapidly, but David could not make out a word of what he was saying. He then motioned to his companions in the small rowboat, and they brought out many blankets and hatchets and tools of various sorts, including sharp knives and small glittering objects. Clawface had them lay these at the feet of the father and his daughter. Suddenly David realized that Clawface was bargaining for the companionship of the daughter. The small family left the objects where they lay and then retreated inland with the rest of the villagers, while Clawface and his companions stood by the gifts that they had brought over in the small boat. David watched as the villagers spoke, one after another. The daughter spoke, and her father spoke, then the mother and other villagers, and the talk went on, but always with great respect. David was aware that he had expected an outright slaughter of Clawface and his companions, but that the villagers were in sincere discussion with each other, and that something very mature was taking place. He then looked closely at the daughter and realized that there was a soft glow around her, very similar to the glow that he had seen around Clawface as he had entered the village. Clawface and his companions sat in a half-circle near the gifts he had brought as the villagers conversed. Suddenly David awoke. It was still dark, and he was lying in the guest room. He didn't remember having gone to bed and didn't really even know what day it was, but that seemed unimportant. What seemed to have awakened him was a brief shade of a memory of something taking place at the dance in the village, the dance at which he had begun to experience the depth of human presence here on the earth. He remembered the atmosphere in the large wooden building, the fire, the shadows, his feeling of companionship with the three boys he had just met and eaten a meal with. Then the dancers began to emerge from the shadows. He remembered the wooden masks with the large beaks that clacked as they opened and closed. He realized that there was a distinct rhythm to this wooden clacking, and he could see again the rhythm of the movement of the dancers. The rhythmic drumming that had preceded the dancing continued to increase in pace and in intensity. He saw that inside of the beaks of the bird masks there was another countenance, a face, sometimes human, sometimes animal, and he experienced again the strange feeling as of something deepening, being pulled more deeply into himself, and then of the panorama of faces and events and presences that he felt within himself, something that almost frightened him, except for the fact that there was also something deeply comforting about this experience. He realized that he had felt as if he were a part of something much larger, much greater, a continuous presence, an aliveness that had not begun with him, but of which he was only one of an endless ongoing link. He had felt deeply that he belonged. And then it suddenly struck him. He had seen a mask and felt a deep shudder throughout his body. The mask was of a human face, and the face had 3 red lines on each side of the forehead and down each cheek. These were the scars that Eagle had left on Clawface. Chapter 5, Helpless. For the next few days, David felt very strange. Something was happening that didn't make sense. Spirals seemed to be connecting within him, memories, thoughts, dreams, possibilities. He couldn't sort things out and seemed to be in some sort of daze. Knowing seemed to have escaped its normal bounds, and he was frightened. Something didn't make sense, and yet there was an experience within himself of deeper layers that had a sense of their own. His own boundaries seemed to be melting, and he was unsure of himself. And yet at the same time he felt a certainty of his place in the world like he had never felt before. But it was a place that was deeper than belonging to a human world. He sensed that in some strange way he belonged between worlds, but he didn't know what those worlds were, or how he had gotten here, or if he could ever get back. But maybe he didn't want to go back. He felt he had been living in a place that was narrow and shallow and superficial, a place of surface and uncertainty, but also a place where he played a role of knowing. Yet here he was, dancing in an unknown place, reaching for something or someone that was not available, or perhaps not yet available, yet not knowing what or where he was reaching toward. He was afraid and yet had never felt more certain in his life. The feeling was deeply uncomfortable and exhilarating. His experience was that several worlds were merging together in ways that were not allowed, and suddenly he realized that his own thinking was having difficulty just allowing the experience he was going through. He needed more control, but he didn't know how or what to control, or so he thought. He felt his thinking straining itself to make sense of what he had been experiencing. Could dreams, in fact, have an effect on what happened in the outer world? And could dreams influence things that had already taken place hundreds of years ago? Then he was aware that he had an investment in the outcome of what he had been dreaming, and that he was taking dreams as reality, when perhaps they were only dreams. He understood that he was stepping into a previously unknown way of knowing, and he wanted things to follow a structure that he was comfortable with, and in which he felt safe. Was he, in fact, going crazy? And what was crazy, anyway? Just because he didn't understand and was confused, did that make him crazy? He wanted the world to fall into a structure, a logical structure, but perhaps there was a deeper way things worked that he had not known before. Did this mean he was crazy? Or was his own thinking just reorganizing itself on a new level, one that he had not yet arrived at, even though he knew he had already left his old level? He felt himself to be in a no-man's land where there were no signposts, and he understood a place where a new language was being created, and he kept trying to use the old language that he had learned since childhood. He felt frustrated and helpless. And then he suddenly brightened. Wasn't it this exactly? He wanted his frustration to disappear, and in order for this to happen, he was trying to force his feeling of helplessness to disappear. What if he just accepted being helpless in this new place? Admit to feeling helpless and embrace it fully, and allow himself some room for things to change within his understanding. That was it. So he laid down on the couch and just melted into helplessness, acknowledging that he didn't know what to do, and that not knowing what to do did not mean that he was out of control, but just that he needed to give up trying to control the situation in which he found himself. He felt strange, weird, as if he didn't know who he was, and so he also embraced this feeling and admitted to himself, right now I really don't even know who I am. He could feel deep layers of his own muscles relaxing and giving up. Then he suddenly saw a caterpillar, a very tired and exhausted caterpillar, a caterpillar who had its entire life been traveling as fast as it could and eating every green thing in sight until it had become so fat that it could hardly take another step. Caterpillar then crawled along a branch and seemed to melt into one of the branches. Looking more closely, David realized it wasn't melting, but that something was changing about it. It seemed to be wrapping itself in a blanket. Had he just now thrown a blanket over himself, lying here on the couch? The blanket hardened into something light and protective, and the caterpillar itself began to melt within that protective shield. Then David realized that the caterpillar itself was melting, getting gooey, fluid, losing the structure that it had known all its life. But it seemed to trust this happening. It abandoned itself to the changes that were taking place within this cocoon. Did it know what it was doing? Did it have any sense of what it was turning into? Did it want to change in this way? Or did it even have a choice in the matter? David realized that he was lying on the couch in some sort of cocoon, a way of thinking that had become stiff and rigid, and that his logic was trying to hold him while something else melted inside him. Something deep inside was reorganizing itself in a way that David had no control over, and it felt weird, and David felt that he himself was changing, but he didn't know how, and he realized that he had become very comfortable in who he had been, and he was trying to hang on to that feeling, rather than trusting something very deep within himself that did know what it was doing, even though he had never before experienced such a thing. His entire logical thinking system was reorganizing itself into an entirely new pattern. And then he fell asleep. Chapter 6. The Healing. The lone ship was arriving again in the bay. This time it felt more familiar. David could clearly see the rigging that raised and lowered the great sails. The wooden deck resounded like a drum as he walked upon it. He moved easily over to the yardarm and climbed into the small boat that was being lowered into the sea. The boat hit the sea with a hard crash, and he and his fellow sailors began rowing. Rowing was hard. The sea was choppy and seemed to resist the oars, and progress was slow as they rowed toward the shore. They could see the entire village amassed on the shore, carrying weapons, clubs, sticks, and axes of one sort or another. David felt his face and ran his fingers along the 3 lines on each side of his face. The ridges were prominent and jagged, and a shudder ran through him. there was also a deep feeling of contentment, of pride, of feeling a warm, solid center within his belly. He knew the man, his companions, looked upon him with awe. He felt proud of the scars, even though he knew they disfigured him horribly. They brought both a sense of pride and of disgust. The men did not want to be on this mission with him. A dread held them together. They felt he was insane, but they were also unable to resist his demands. He held a sway over them that they didn't understand, a control that each one felt deep in his own belly. They rowed in unison. He among them rowed harder than any, and slowly the boat inched toward the shore. None of the men felt they would survive. Only Clawface was dead certain. Arriving close to shore, Clawface jumped out of the boat and helped tow it to shallow water. He moved easily toward the amassed people, and they parted to let him pass. He walked directly to the man he had shot and his daughter. Some inexorable power pulled him toward them. Standing before them, he put his hands together and bowed toward the father, saying words that neither the father nor his daughter understood, but words they could feel came from deep within this strange man. They understood him to say that he was sorry that he had shot the father and was happy that he had survived. He traced the scars on his face and gestured upward toward the sky, honoring the eagle that had resolved the strange encounter. He put his hands to his heart and then opened them toward the daughter, and a wave of warmth and color spread over her face and body. He listened respectfully as the man replied. His voice was warm and mature, reflecting a deep understanding and a wisdom that surprised Scarface and also thrilled him. The father touched the place on his body that had been wounded, and then touched the scars on Scarface's face. Looking into the sky, he waved his hand upward in an arc, connecting their mutual wounds and honoring the great eagle that had saved them both, and perhaps the entire village, with its strange act. Both Scarface and the father understood what they were doing, even though neither understood a word that the other spoke. They were participants in a drama that was a link in time, a profound act of presence, and a healing ceremony that had begun with the first hints of life on this earth. They both knew it, and yet had no idea how they knew it. But they also knew it was a ceremony that emanated from the very cells of their bodies, and they both felt there was only one body, and that it was healing itself. Chapter 7. Scared. David awoke with a start. He felt the whole house had shaken him awake. He was sweating, and his breath was intense and quick. He instinctively moved his hand to his face to feel the scars, but there were none, at least not on the surface. He felt different and totally confused, but the feeling was also good. Something had changed in him, but he did not know what. He felt like two parts of himself had grown suddenly together, two halves of himself that had been strangers, perhaps even enemies, had come together in a profound meeting and had both found a home in him. He was larger, somehow softer, but more sure of himself. And he was shaken to his roots as Cornelia spoke. "You were asleep for a long, long time. I tried to wake you up, but I couldn't. You were speaking some strange language and rubbing your face, and there was a strange kind of light around you. It was scary." David had not realized she was sitting right in front of him, and almost jumped up to run when he heard her voice. He felt shaky and unsure of where he was, or even what year it was. The dream had been so real. "Why do you look so strange at me? What happened? What were you dreaming about?" David had no idea how to answer her. Words did not come. He just looked at her and looked at her. "Now you're really scaring me," she said. "The future and the past are strangely woven together," he heard himself say, but he was not even sure that it was his voice that spoke. "There is a pattern that binds us all together and everything in the universe, and we are also parts of that pattern, as well as its weavers." He did not know where these words were coming from. He had not thought them out before. They were just spilling out of him like water out of a fountain. He looked gently at this kind girl before him, his little sister, and he knew instinctively that she was not only a part of the pattern, but would turn out to be one of its greatest weavers. But he had no idea how he knew this.